From New York Times Opinion, this is The Ezra Klein Show. So a bit of housekeeping ahead of today's episode. We are hiring a calm assistant for me and Tracy McMillan-Cottom to do fact-checking, research, clerical work. It's a great entry-level role, and you can find it by clicking the link in the show notes here or going to nytco.com/careers. So I've done a couple episodes recently on the Republican Party, and we wanted to follow that up with a couple different views on the Democratic Party. And I think for Democrats, the core question that I get asked, that you hear asked, is why are Democrats letting this unpopular 81-year-old president run again? I think it's worth stepping back and asking, if you were a politician in the Democratic Party who had wanted to run against Joe Biden, what would you have run on? One theory of how you would challenge an incumbent president would be you would say he's a bad president. But actually, Biden has passed a ton of critical legislation from Democrats, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, chips and science. The economy is doing pretty well. The labor market is really strong. Inflation is coming down. So it's kind of hard to run saying Joe Biden has done a bad job being president. I mean, there are important differences now increasingly on foreign policy, but if you think back 8 months ago, that wasn't as true. The other way you could have run against Joe Biden is to say the guy's a loser. He's not going to be able to win. And the crucial moment for that, I think, the way to think about why Biden in the end did not face so much pressure that he either had to step aside or face a set of serious primary challenges, is that in 2022, Democrats did not get wiped out. And more than did not get wiped out, they won. They did much better than you would have expected. They gained in the Senate, they gained in state legislatures, they gained in governorships. They did lose the House, but they held down losses. And I always thought that if Democrats got wiped out in 2022, there really would be primary challenges. And because they did so much better than expected, there wasn't really room for them to get off the ground. There wasn't a critique to be made of Biden's Democratic Party. It wasn't obviously losing elections. It wasn't failing to govern. So how are you going to attack it? That doesn't mean that Democrats have made the right decision, but I think it is crucial context. And context that is often lost in thinking about why Democrats are making the strategic decisions they're making. There is this difference between how Democrats are polling and how they are performing. But the Democratic Party is a complicated thing that no one player really holds power over. And so I wanted to take it from two very different perspectives. And I'll say, even as we go into these episodes, I don't fully agree with either theory of the Democratic Party. But opposite ways of thinking about something can both carry important truths, or at least things worth thinking about. And I wanted to begin then with a perspective that gets heard less often, but I think explains more in terms of how the Democratic Party is actually acting, which is that if you look at elections rather than polls and look at governance rather than vibes, Democrats are not doing that badly. It's actually a little hard to make the case that it is a party making huge mistakes. They definitely don't look like a party in crisis. So for this show, for the more optimistic perspective on the Democrats, I invited strategist Simon Rosenberg on the show. Rosenberg has been in Democratic Party politics a long time. He played a key role in Clinton's 1992 election victory. He founded and was a longtime head of the New Democrats Network, which was an influential think tank that at times has been pushing Democrats in more liberal and in more moderate directions. That was very early in trying to build a stronger Hispanic strategy for the Democratic Party. And he became kind of famous again in 2022 for accurately predicting that there would not be a red wave, that the belief that Democrats were going to get destroyed was not going to prove to be correct. Now he's the author of the Substack Hopium Chronicles, where he is trying to offer Democrats this constant argument that they're way too down on the party. And actually they have a lot of reason for hope and work to do, sure, but that they need to understand they're coming to this from a strong position. As always, my email, EzraKleinShow@nytimes.com. Simon Rosenberg, welcome to the show.
Ezra, it's great to be here.
So when I looked at polls at about this point in the cycle in 2016, Trump was trailing a bit. When I look at polls at this point in the cycle in 2024, he's roughly even with Biden, I mean, it depends on the poll you look at. He's maybe ahead, maybe behind, but stronger than he was. And most Democrats I know are freaking out about those polls. So why aren't you?
Because since Trump unveiled himself as MAGA in the 2017-2018 cycle, we just keep winning elections, right? We won the 2018 cycle. We won the 2020 cycle. We won in ways that people never thought we would in 2022. And in 2023, which I think has not gotten as much coverage as it should have, it was a blue wave all across the country. We won in all sorts of Republican places and flipped seats and ballot initiatives all across the country. And when you just look at that as a political person, right, that's exactly what you want a political party to be doing. We're winning all kinds of elections, right? Democrats keep overperforming in elections. Republicans keep underperforming and struggling. And we even saw it just this week. In Iowa, despite Trump's strong victory, turnout there was abysmal. I mean, they had 186,000 people voted in 2016. Only 110,000 people voted this time. Trump only got 7% of all registered Republicans voted for Donald Trump in Iowa. It's a terrible number. And so when we actually go vote, we just keep winning and they keep losing. And so I go into 2024 feeling really good about where we are. Look, we have a lot of work to do, Ezra. I'm not sitting here and telling you everything is great. We got a long way to go. But if we run a good campaign and execute well, I think we're going to win this election by high single digits and make this election a clear repudiation of MAGA, which will hopefully start to loosen its dark grip on the Republican Party.
So you and I have known each other a long time, but I think you've had a burst of renown in politics after 2022 when you were one of relatively few people out there saying this is not going to be a red wave election. Democrats are going to hold on much better than people think. And that's more or less what happened. They won seats in the Senate. They won governorships. They won state legislatures. They held down losses in the House. You've made the argument, based on what we can see in data about the 2022 election, that there were really two elections in there that had different dynamics. What were they?
I think it's sort of very foundational to understand where we are today. And so in 2022, there were two elections. There was a bluer election inside the battleground and a redder election outside the battleground. Inside the battleground, where Democrats turned on their big campaigns, we were able to actually not just do well, but we got to 59% in Colorado, 57% in Pennsylvania, 55% in Michigan, 54% in New Hampshire. Those would be extraordinary performances in a good year. And this was supposed to be a bad year for us, right? We were supposed to be the party that was, the red wave was going to wash all across the country and wipe us out. And so we did extraordinarily well where we were contesting Republicans, in many cases, these Trumpy Republicans that were nominated in these states, and where the issues of abortion and democracy were on the ballot. And we actually gained ground against all conventional wisdom outside the battleground, where we didn't have these big campaigns, where we didn't control the information environment and push our turnout to the upper end of what was possible. We actually lost ground in New York and in California, and it's one of the reasons we lost the House in 2022. And so to me, the admonition is where we run our big campaigns, we do really well. When we go head-to-head with Republicans and the grassroots of the Democratic Party is focused, we keep winning. But when we don't run those campaigns, it reminds us of the power of the right-wing noise machine and their politics, which is still formidable. And we can't in any way discount the significance of their ability on a daily basis to dictate the daily discourse in the United States. And so we need to, in 2024, we need to get much more focused as Democrats about being loud and trying to close that, what I call the loudness gap with the right, in order to be where we want to be in 2024.
I want to pick up on a few questions and counter theories there. So one, you said something interesting, which is that in these battleground areas, Democrats controlled the information environment. They ran their campaigns. And I read it differently, which is to say that in those battleground environments, what actually happened is that Republicans controlled the information environment and ran their, or MAGA actually, in many cases, controlled the information environment and ran their campaigns. And that is an extraordinary counter-mobilizing force for Democrats. Something you said there I think is really important. I don't think people quite realize that it was Democrats in New York and California who lost the House by not coming out. So those were not huge MAGA elections. Those were not elections people felt had a big sense of weight to them. And because they then had low turnout, Democrats gave up seats. But in the battlegrounds where MAGA candidates were a mobilizing force for Democrats, Democrats did great. And so there is a theory of the Democratic Party right now. Michael Podhorzer, the former AFL-CIO political director, kind of makes this argument that it's an anti-MAGA coalition, that it is turned itself into a vessel to stop this other political tendency. And where that tendency is on the ballot, it rises. And where that tendency is not on the ballot, it struggles. Does that track for you?
Yeah, I mean, the anti-MAGA theory is something that I actually promoted very heavily in 2022 during the time where I was battling the red wave. And I think there is what I often said during that time was there was an anti-MAGA majority in the country that we saw show up in 2018 and 2020. And so the question is, would it show up again in 2022? I mean, I wrote a piece in the fall of 2021 saying that I thought this would be a close competitive election and not a wave election because of this, because there had been, the Republicans have made, in the grand scheme of politics, right, when you have a politics that loses twice in a row, as it did for the Republicans in 2018 and 2020, MAGA, that is, usually a party runs away from that politics because it's failed and they lost elections and they lost the House, the Senate, and the presidency in those two elections. The Republicans didn't do that. They ran right towards MAGA, right? They doubled down. They became super MAGA. And that's, in my view, an enormous strategic error that is continuing through to today, right? I mean, we saw this play out not just in 2022, but in 2023. It's already playing out in early 2024. I think MAGA is even unattractive to Republican voters, and I think the Republican Party is splintered. What's interesting for me about this is that if you watch cable news, if you watch MSNBC, a third of the contributors and a third of the people on TV are former Republicans, right, in some form or fashion. We've never had that kind of abandonment or splintering of a modern political party in our lifetime. Yes, MAGA is deeply unattractive, and my argument is that Trump and MAGA are even more unattractive, more dangerous, more ugly, more extreme in 2024 than they were even in 2022 and 2023. And so if this has been a failed politics in all these elections, they continue to double down on it, then I think it's why I'm so optimistic about what we're going to be able to do this year.
But let me flip part of that dynamic on you. You made the point, you often see these former Republicans on MSNBC, which is true. And there is a slice of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, has begun to win over, which is these more educated, higher information, which these folks are, of course, at the apex of. And the argument you will hear from people who are a lot less sanguine about this than you are is that Democrats have been outperforming in 2018 and 2022 and 2023 because they've won over a kind of voter that used to be Republican and is more likely to come out in a lower turnout special election, more likely to know what's going on, show up at the polls. But in a presidential election where you get a lot more kind of unusual voters, where you get a lot more low attachment voters, Republicans are doing, stronger numbers among some of those factions. And it's not like Donald Trump saw his number of voters collapse from 2016 to 2020. More people voted for Donald Trump in 2020 than voted in 2016. It's just even more people than that voted for Joe Biden. But it was close enough that a shift in the wins could lead to Joe Biden winning the popular vote by 2.5 points and losing the presidency. So there is no margin here.
Well, listen, I understand the theory, and it's a theory. It's not actually played out in practice. It could happen in 2024. It might be what happens, but it hasn't happened, right? The theory is that, all this, the fact that Democrats just keep winning everywhere in red states and blue states and ballot initiatives and off-year elections and special elections isn't going to translate over into 2024. And yet, when you look at what's happened when we've gone to the general election since 1992, Democrats have won more votes in 7 out of 8 presidential elections. No American political party has done that in our history. It's the best popular vote run for a political party in American history. And in the last 4 elections, we've beaten the Republicans on average by 51 to 46, right? A 5-point gap. The last time Democrats averaged over 50% of the vote in 4 consecutive elections was during FDR's presidency. And so we're in the midst of our best presidential run that we've been on since the 1930s and 40s. And this idea that somehow something's going to happen in this election that has not happened in 7 out of 8 of the previous presidential elections and isn't happening across the states, it's a theory of somebody who doesn't really work in politics every day, because that's not really how politics works, right? There isn't one set of dynamics that are playing out again and again and again all across the country. And then all of a sudden, everything dramatically shifts. And so I know this could happen. I understand the theory. A lot could happen. A meteor could hit the Earth tomorrow. I don't think it's going to happen in 2024 for all the reasons that we discussed earlier about the counter-mobilization against MAGA, which is still the most powerful force in our politics, far more powerful than disappointment in Joe Biden and the Democrats.
So I have this experience sometimes when I listen to you because it's very persuasive on one level. And then I also have this kind of like, wait, but like I've just been living through this other thing happening, which is there is no such thing in the American political system as a popular vote presidential election. The only thing that matters is the Electoral College. I am old enough to remember Donald Trump winning the Electoral College in 2016. It feels very fresh as a wound. I'm also old enough to remember that he had a Republican House and Senate then. Democrats did win that back in 2018. They, although they did well in 2022, they did lose the House, right? There is a Republican speaker now. In fact, there have been many Republican speakers since Democrats lost the House in 2022. Republicans control more governor's mansions. They control more state legislatures. There is a lot of truth to this. And so as a corrective, I buy it, right? There is a tendency, I think, to see Donald Trump and MAGA as this unstoppable political force. And the polls are now feeding a kind of panic about that among Democrats. But also, to listen to you, you're describing a dominant political party that is wielding power continuously. But Republicans have the Supreme Court, they have the House, they have the governorships, they have the state legislatures. Democrats have the presidency and the Senate. I would not say, well, the Democratic Party is an obviously dominant party on a historic run of success.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree. I understand.
But what don't you agree with?
Don't discount the importance of a popular vote, right? I mean, we're in a democracy, and winning more votes than the other side is the core of what a campaign is about.
Are we in a democracy, though?
Well, I mean, this is...
Oftentimes we're not.
I know, and I've written about this extensively, and you and I, actually, the last time that you and I actually really connected was actually over this issue, right? Mm-hmm. About how our power is appropriated in the United States and how, you can be a party winning elections by 5 points and still not be in power. Right now, I just want to remind your listeners that people say the popular vote doesn't matter in a general election. Of course it does, because there are tons of down ballot races below the Senate and House races all across the country. And so, winning an election by 4 or 5 points, of course it matters, right? Because there's all these other elections happening too. And so both can be true, right? You want to both win the popular vote and you want to win the Electoral College. So what I look at, and the reason that I am talking the way that I talk about this, is that what's happened to a great degree is that we've had a couple bad elections where Republicans have run up the score, and it's one of the reasons why they've maintained so much political power around the country. But on balance, where I'm satisfied with our performance is that, for a party that when I got into this business back in the late 80s and early 90s, where the Republicans were on this incredible presidential run, the Democratic Party in the late 80s and early 90s was getting wiped out at the presidential level. And the reason that the New Democrats came about was to reverse that and was to create a competitive national party again. And since 1992 in Clinton's presidency, we've won more votes 7 out of 8 times. And yes, 2 of those elections, we didn't win the Electoral College and they won the presidential election. But the goal was to make us competitive at a national level again when we weren't. I mean, this idea that at some point the Democrats used to be really strong and have sort of fallen down, the exact opposite is true. We used to be really weak and we were getting killed in national elections, and now we're not. In fact, we're in the best popular vote run that we've been on, since the FDR's presidency. I can see Joe Biden's path for victory as a strategist, right? He's been a good president. He's going to have a strong case for re-election. We keep winning elections all across the country. Trump, to me, is a much weaker candidate than he was in 2016 and 2020. I don't know how you dress this guy up, Donald Trump, and make him look like a serious candidate for president again. I just don't think it's possible. And part of the reason why is not just because he's more extreme and more dangerous than he was, and MAGA is more of a threat to the country, but his performance on the stump is far worse and more wild. And so when I look as somebody who's been doing this for over 30 years, what I see is a really crappy presidential candidate, and I think we're going to kick his ass.
You're a strategist, and you see a path to clean victory for Joe Biden. So if you were running that campaign, what's the approach? What's the message? What would you be telling Joe Biden to be doing, saying, emphasizing?
We're going to have a hard time, I think, in the day-to-day information war. What Trump still have and what the Republicans still have is they're much louder than we are. Just his ability to dominate the daily news and to give us very little space to make our case. And I think this is also exacerbated by Joe Biden's age and just his, this is where his age is not an asset. I think in general, his age is an asset. It's made him a strong president. But I think it means that as somebody who grew up in politics in the war room in 1992, which was really about reinventing the way that information and media is done in a campaign and how you contest the information space every day. The theory of the campaign in 92, coming out of the loss of Dukakis, is that we had to contest the information space every day. Then any attack that was made, if we didn't rebut it or counter it, it would stick. We were very on the front foot. We were fighting with incredible intensity. The Biden communications operation, to me, has a slightly different understanding of all this, which is that they believe there are things that are never going to amount to anything that's going to matter, and they can kind of ignore them. And I just don't agree with that. and I don't agree with that from having been in this game for a long time. I was a guest on Fox News for 17 years and did thousands of appearances on Fox. I mean, I've been in this thing pretty deeply for a long time. And I think if my greatest advice to the campaign is that there has to be a tempo and an expectation that they are fighting with unbelievable ferocity and intensity every day in the information space in order for us to control the information environment and to allow us to win. And that's, to me, the most important thing that we need to do in the coming months.
I don't think they're ever going to do that. And let me try an analogy on you that's been in my head, which is that Trump is a street fighter. His theory of the information space is that of a street fighter. He's going to punch at it and hit it with a pole as hard as he can till it crumbles beneath him. And Biden and his team, going back now some years, and I think this might be somewhat mediated by their own concerns about him or what he's willing to do and not do, but whatever it is, they do Aikido. They try to let the other person create the energy and use it against them. I actually think the one thing Donald Trump and Joe Biden agree on is that Donald Trump should be in the news every day and Donald Trump should control the information space. Look, getting into the news, this is my profession, is not a mystery if you're the president. You announce things that are significant enough. You say things that are conflictual enough, or you do things that are unexpected or outrageous enough. Donald Trump does all of them constantly to the extent that he can, right? There's a reason he's showing up at all these hearings and getting in arguments with the judges. He wants that covered on the news. If Joe Biden and his team believed it was good for them or wanted to, or believed Joe Biden was good at being in constant fights with Donald Trump, they could unload on him day after day after day after day. And I think their view, and this has been my sense of them for some time, is that it is good for them when Donald Trump dominates the news because, again, it's a counter-MAGA coalition. It's an anti-MAGA coalition. And as long as you have some MAGA figure driving the story day after day after day, that will ultimately counter-mobilize the Democrats. And the counter-mobilization of the Democrats is larger than the mobilization of the Republicans. That's, I think, what they're trying to do. I'm not saying it's my preferred strategy, but that's my read of them.
I think you're exactly right, by the way. Completely, right? And I talk to them all the time, and I'm close to both the campaign and the White House. What I don't mean is getting in his face every day. Democrats have to feel the campaign. They have to feel us fighting. They have to feel the intensity, because part of the reason we've been winning so much is because of this counter-mobilization. And the counter-mobilization isn't just with voters, it's with our activists. There is a massive new democratic political machine that has grown up organically in recent years. It was very accelerated during COVID when these new technologies allowed remote activity. And one of the remote activities is Zoom. I mean, what's happening now is that there are hundreds of thousands of Democrats who are listening to people like me over a Zoom and campaign people and other folks, Democratic politics, every week on Zooms, where they have this far more intimate relationship with politics than they ever used to have. And so what's happening is the counter-mobilization is also providing our campaigns more money than they've ever had in our history. We're building unprecedentedly large campaigns with the biggest field operations we've ever had. And there are more volunteers to fit into those campaigns than we've ever had before, because you can now not just export your money out of California, you can export your labor. And, I had yesterday, we won this race in Orlando, and I spoke to Fentress Driscoll, who's the state House leader for the Democrats, who I worked with very closely on this race. And she said, at the victory party, Simon, a woman came up to me and said, I'm here. I drove 2 hours to be with you and do GOTV because Simon asked me to go help you guys, right? And so what's happening is this counter-mobilization has created the strongest Democratic Party than any of us have ever seen. And it's why, what I wrote in the fall of 2021 is I said, because of all of this, we had more tools to mitigate midterm drop-off than we've ever had before. And I felt that we were going to be able to use that to have a good election in 2022. Well, that huge machine just played a major role in winning an election in Orlando, Florida, that nobody in Florida thought we were going to win. We flipped the state house in Virginia just in November, which none of the political operatives on the ground thought we were going to do. And we keep doing things that we didn't think we could do. We keep performing at the upper end of what's possible as Democrats because of this machine, this counter-mobilization you're describing. And I think it's just going to be too big and too overwhelming for Donald Trump in 2024 because it's independent of any candidate. It has nothing to do with who's running. It's not connected to an ideology. It's this simple thing. Democrats are going to save the country. Republicans are dangerous. And you've got millions of proud patriots who love their country who are fighting to make sure their democracy doesn't slip away. They have nothing like that.
So I want to go back to the question I asked you about Biden and his path, because when I said, what would you tell them to do? You said fight. But I actually meant to ask something closer to what should this be about? One thing they want to make it about clearly is Donald Trump and MAGA and democracy, right? You go to Biden's big speech a couple weeks ago about democracy on January 6th. They're in many ways running against Donald Trump almost as if Trump is an incumbent. But Joe Biden is the incumbent. And you go back to 2020 and how they ran then. They ran against Trump, and he was the incumbent, and they ran against the pandemic, right? They ran against the Trump administration's pandemic operation, which at that point was completely flailing. And right now, there is no pandemic at that level that is dominating politics. Obviously, there's a lot of COVID going around. Donald Trump is not the incumbent. And the bigger problem Biden faces, I think, is widespread voter dissatisfaction with the economy, which is somewhere where I do think polls are important. I don't believe polls are predictive of elections this far out, but they are reasonable snapshots of public opinion, and people are not happy with the state of the economy. And when you ask them who they trust on it, they say they trust Donald Trump. So in terms of what the Biden administration should be saying about itself in the election, what should they be saying?
Well, listen, they've made it very clear, based on that speech in Valley Forge, that they believe the sort of foundational contrast is Joe Biden, protecting democracy and Donald Trump trying to end it. And it's a pretty powerful argument. It's actually been working pretty well all across the country. And it's also true, right? It has the virtue of being true. And we know from polling and market research that we all do that creating a narrative about who we are around freedom is incredibly powerful. And this has been heavily tested by lots of different people. And it's how we've been running, frankly, in these elections that we keep winning. And so I think, first of all, he's on the right track. This is a very good early orientation. I do think there's also going to be an element of the campaign that's about, making the case that he's been a good president and then rolling out, which I assume is going to happen in the State of the Union, his second-term agenda. And these things are also going to matter a lot. I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are about our ability to sell his economic story, because I don't think the country is down on the economy. I think that Republicans are. And if you look at Democrats and the people that are available to us and the people who we have to talk to get to win the election, They actually give Biden very high marks on the economy, and they think the economy is doing really well. I think this is one of these polarized issues that we, just like the Biden approval rating, I don't think it's nearly as descriptive as people think it is. So I think we can make progress there. I don't know that we're going to catch up with Trump on the economy, but I think there's a lot of ground we can make up this year once the campaign really engages. And so your point is—
I want to stop there for a minute, because I think this is actually very important and is a big question for me in the election. I'm not pessimistic or optimistic on their ability to sell an economic message. What I do think is true is that I spend time looking at the consumer sentiment data. I spend time looking at the polling here. I spend time looking at the various indicators we have of how the economy is doing and how people are feeling about it. And what looks both like a huge opportunity for them to me and a genuine problem for them to me is that there is a gigantic delta between what the economy looks like and how people feel about it. If you were just running this through a statistics machine, Joe Biden's record looks fantastic. Like, you want to be Joe Biden. Created a huge number of jobs. Unemployment is extremely low. Wage gains have been very strong. Inflation was up, but now it's down. We are outperforming European economies that kind of look like ours superficially. Like, if you wanted to be
now. That's right. You sound like me now.
But this is just the economic facts, right?
Yeah.
Like, a campaign is an effort, right, to tell a story. We have a serious affordability crisis, in my mind, specifically in housing and a couple other things. But that's been going on for a very long time. But in the economic data, it looks very strong. This is the data you would want as the raw material to tell a story. And whatever they're doing to tell the story or not tell the story, it is not working. Elections are also about the public perception. They are not just about people reading the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. How do they close that gap?
So number one, just like what happened in 2022, where everyone thought we were going to lose because there was low Biden approval and high inflation, and we ended up having a really good election, despite the disappointment with the economy that you're describing, we keep winning everywhere. Because going back to the thing that you said in the beginning of the interview, is there's a force in our politics that's more powerful than disappointment in Joe Biden and the Democrats, which is the fear and opposition to MAGA. That's the thing that's been driving our politics since 2018, and it's going to drive the election in 2024. The second thing is, you're right, a campaign is about putting information into people's heads that they don't have, right? I mean, that's the core of what you do in a campaign. That's why advertising exists, right? Is you're moving narratives and stories that people need to hear that they may not totally understand. Look, part of what's a challenge now, there isn't one information environment in the United States. There are at least two, and there may be even more. But Republicans are living in a completely different information environment than Democrats are, or than non-MAGA, non-Republicans. And in the non-MAGA information environment, the economy is actually doing well. People are happy.
No, wait, I want to push you on this because I know where you're going here.
I can show you tons of data on this.
Yeah, but I know the media environments very well. And what I would say is, yes, there's a very MAGA information environment. There's also, like, obviously a more liberal information environment. But most people are not in really either one of them. Most people just don't read that much news because the news makes you feel bad and people have other things they want to do in their lives. They get the news ambiently. And I want to say extremely clearly, I think that is a perfectly reasonable life choice to make, right? Like, that is the way human beings mostly operate. Lives are busy. They have other things they want to focus on. I always say that the biggest divide in the news is not left to right. It's interested, uninterested. The news is fundamentally a hobby. I can look at the polling on how people feel about the economy, and I can tell you the number of people dissatisfied is significantly larger, multiples larger than the number of people watching Fox News, to say nothing of watching or absorbing smaller than Fox News conservative outlets. So I don't want to just give that all to the news.
No, I'm not going to give it all to the news, but let's just go to data, right? I mean, because I think that one of the things you were saying earlier is that we have to distinguish when we talk about these things, particularly here in your kind of setting, between things that are true and things that people believe, because they're not the same. And it's really important in a time of rising untruth that we don't give up on the idea that there is an objective reality out there. And the objective reality is the country's far better off than when Joe Biden came to office in the midst of COVID, a huge recession, and insurrection and all the other things that were happening. And that's why I believe that over the course of this election, he's going to be able to make the case that he's made the country better, which was his primary goal as president. And he's got a strong agenda for the second term, right? But I go back to this basic idea. If you look at polling, and in polls, high quality, large interview polls on the economy, Democrats are giving Biden very high marks on the economy and believe the economy is doing really well, right? There is a huge divergence in the universe that we have to talk to that's available to us, because 40% of the country is not available to us. We have no ability to reach them. People are not nearly as down on the economy as the overall numbers are. They just aren't. I mean, this is clear as day. When you look at these other measures, life satisfaction, job satisfaction, income satisfaction, right? Life satisfaction numbers are up in the 70s and 80s. Job satisfaction numbers are up in the 60s. Income satisfaction are in the 50s, right? And if you look at the Axios poll that they released just the other day on questions of how are you doing, not how's the economy doing, the numbers are way up in the 50s and 60s. And so what it means to me is that we can make significant progress on this issue. We may not catch up to Trump, but we can't expect to have the election we want to have if we're trailing Trump on the economy by 10 points. And so we've got work to do here. But to your point, we have really powerful raw material to make the argument. And I think television advertising and a real campaign where we're prosecuting this stuff every day, I'm optimistic we can make progress because it's true. And things being true does matter in a campaign. It's easier to win arguments that are true than to win arguments that aren't true traditionally in a campaign. It's not always the case, right? But usually the case. So what we have to do is doable in traditional politics. The things we have to do are doable. The things they have to do, I don't think are doable. I don't think that they can take this guy. Because let me make one basic point about Trump, which we haven't talked about, is that the question was asked of Iowa voters, Iowa Republicans, if he is convicted of a crime, would you view it as a disqualifier for him being able to run for president? 30% of those voters said it would be a disqualifier. If you want to talk about a blinking red warning light about the potential for the Trump candidacy to collapse and for us to have a rout in the election, the data is there if you want to look at it. The second data piece on this, NBC Sunday poll with Des Moines Register, Haley voters, 20% of the Iowa electorate, were asked in the poll, would you vote for Trump or Biden in the general election? 43% said Biden, 22% said Trump. I mean, these are crazy numbers. I mean, if we get 40% of the Haley voters, right, we're going to be getting up into the 50s. Now, I don't think they'll all come with us, but there is incredible, clear data from this past week that Trump is a deeply troubled candidate and that he could easily go into the general election as the most wounded, degraded candidate that we've seen in the modern era.
You worked for Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
You were in the Barack Obama Democratic Party orbit.
Yep.
And both of them, I think, are interesting here. If you go back to their midterm elections, they got stomped, absolutely stomped. Under Clinton, Democrats lost the House for the first time in 40 years. Under Obama, the Democratic Party just got annihilated in 2010. And they both looked fairly weak. Obviously, Joe Biden had a better midterm than they did. And he's polling a little bit behind where they were, which people can interpret in different ways. But what lessons do those politicians have for him or the Democratic Party now? What can Joe Biden learn from what Clinton and Obama did to then win re-election?
Both of those campaigns started much earlier than the Biden campaign has. You know, Clinton was an incredible politician and was in the game every day and let his team loose early on in 1995. We really set the terms of the debate early, which really, you know, we ended up winning re-election by 8 points. So, I mean, it was an enormous victory in 1996. And Obama, same thing. I mean, the campaign was much further along than where the Biden campaign is now. And so to me, the urgency of the moment is they've got to just accelerate the development of the campaign. Campaigns are organic things. They grow. It's like building a battleship, right? You can't do it overnight. You can't just flip a switch and a campaign turns on. You have to hire people, and some people don't work out, and you try tactics and they don't work, and you got to learn from it. And you got to keep reiterating all the time. And this is why I'm talking about the need for them to engage more frontally in the day-to-day battle, because we've got to go through an accelerated process of getting this thing into a general election, day-to-day general election mode. We have a very short window here now. I mean, the general election's really beginning. I mean, it's now. Trump's won functionally, and we're in the general election. I think Trump is going to start attacking Biden much more frontally very soon, I would imagine, even with his ads and in terms of their day-to-day engagement, because he doesn't really have any opposition in the Republican Party anymore. And I think the campaign isn't really ready for that right now. And so, to me, the most important thing is Biden world needs to accelerate the development of the campaign.
I think a lot, as a lot of people do, about the role Joe Biden's age will play in the campaign. I mean, you look at polling, Biden's age is the number one concern voters have about him. But then I've been trying to think about what is that concern at its core? Because something you'll hear people say, I've said something like it. I think he's been a pretty good president, right? Not that I wouldn't argue with some things he has done, but I think economic outcomes are looking strong. I think his management of a lot of foreign policy crises has been very stable, like very steady. The ability to build international coalitions has been very impressive. The congressional dynamics have been very good. They've gotten a lot of big legislation passed. That said, I think two things emerge here. One is that organizations reflect their leaders. That is a truism across any organization you can think of, businesses, campaigns, everything. And what you were saying about Bill Clinton, about Barack Obama, about the energy of it, right? Clinton being out there, right, immediately after the loss in the midterms. Barack Obama, right, beginning to try all these grand bargains and super negotiating committees and, right, just endlessly out there showing that, he's trying and Biden hangs back, right? And I think his organization predictably, has this quality of him. There is a lack of energy to it because there's a lack of energy at this point to him, which I do think is age-related. I followed Joe Biden for a long time. This is not something I would have said about the Joe Biden of 2000 or 2008 or 2012. That's one dimension of it. The other dimension of it that worries me is that I think at a very fundamental level, and this is going to be reflected in a piece I'm working on, the Democratic Party has become the party of normalcy, almost like the conservative party in a more philosophical way, the party that is saying, we are going to keep American democracy. We are going to have relatively competent people in the relevant positions doing the things they're supposed to be doing. It's not democratic socialism. It's not intense around different forms of identity anymore. Like under Joe Biden and in relationship to MAGA, the Democratic Party, at least for this moment in American politics, is the party of normalcy. And the one problem with that for them is that Joe Biden is himself somewhat abnormal. He is just older than we've ever seen in a president. And in terms of that promise of stability, of consistency, the promise that on an emotional level is a party saying to everybody, look, those people are nuts. We've got this. We have the people who can just keep this under control. And then people see Joe Biden and he doesn't project that command to them. I mean, command is a performance. It's a sense of what people are capable of. It's energy. It's not just outcomes. And that feels to me to be where right now I look at his age and I see it actually affecting things. I think that he hangs back in part because of whether they don't think he's an effective messenger or he doesn't want to. I don't know. But it just reflects something now in him that is now we're seeing it in the campaign. And I think this fundamental thing they want to say, which is we are the party of people you can trust and they're the party of people who God knows what. People worry about his ability to do this. And they've not even tried, as best I can tell, to answer that, right? Like you could imagine things they could do, but they are not trying. And those things concern me.
Yeah, no, listen, I was listening very closely to what you were saying because I think it's very nuanced and you've obviously, you're writing a piece about it. So you've been thinking about it and I think it was very well articulated. And so let me try to respond. I do think that we have to litigate the age issue in this election. And the way that I tell Democrats all the time, we have to run towards it, not run away from it, because it really matters. It's front of mind for voters, and we can't pretend that it isn't. And I think we have to make the case that, as somebody who's formerly young myself, that when you get older, you not just lose a step, but you also gain wisdom, experience, and capabilities, and that wisdom, experience, and capability have been central to his success, and that his success as president is actually because of his age, not despite of it. I do believe that we're going to have to invest a lot of money and energy in explaining why the first term was successful. He offered to do one thing in the first term, which was to get us to the other side of COVID effectively, and he has. And he needs to own that, I think, and to make it clear that you made me president to do this thing. I did it. We're on the other side. And I think that he's going to be able, to make a very clear argument that you asked me to do something. I did it. I got two more big things I want to do with all of you together. If you elect me, we can do those things together and continue to make progress. This next set of challenges have to be grounded, I think, deeply in this fight for democracy domestically and abroad. And I also think climate change is this other existential fight that's in front of us. And so I do think there's a way to address all that. But the other part of what you said is that I do think the communications burden of this election is going to fall much more on the campaign than is traditionally the case. Think about the difference between running a campaign for this Joe Biden and running it for Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, who were two of the best communicators in modern American history. It means that the campaign has greater responsibilities. And so it means that the ability of the campaign to execute the team that's in there, their strategies, their day-to-day operations, their, mobilizing, what I've called for is a reinvention of the war room, right? This is part of the new way we have to be thinking, which is the war room in our mind's eye is 20 sweaty kids drinking Red Bulls, producing TikTok videos. And what we need the war room to be now is 2 to 3 million people who are networked into the campaign, amplifying the good works of Joe Biden and the Democrats to redesign a campaign so that the campaign itself is louder, is taking on more communications responsibility, acknowledging everything that you're describing, right? It has to do more and be better than most presidential campaigns have had to be in recent years, which is why, we needed to get going, right? It needs to accelerate its growth. But look, you're raising really important issues. I think these are all things that can be managed. They're not unmanageable in a political context. I think fixing Donald Trump and making him look like a presidential candidate is not something that is manageable.
I want to talk about some trends inside the Democratic Party that stretch before and beyond Joe Biden. And the big one is the changing composition of the party. So it's, I think, cliche at this point, known to say that Democrats have gained higher income voters, lost working class voters. I'll put some numbers to that. In 1968, 52% of white people who never attended college voted Democratic. In 2020, only 35% did. When you look at voters of color, Donald Trump improved his margins among particularly working class Latinos between 2016 and 2020. Democrats did not hugely roll that back in 2022. So even if Democrats can win elections with this sort of emergent, higher income, more educated coalition, why are they losing working class voters? And what can they do about it?
I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that Biden won voters under $100,000 in 2020.
Yes, but by less than Democrats used to, and that's consistent across elections going before Biden.
I think, but this is important because we're not losing working class voters. We actually won working class voters in 2020, right? And because of the strong performance with Hispanic and, minority people of color, working class voters. And yes, some of the margins have been cut a little bit, and we'll see if that happens again in 2024. I think 2020 was a highly unusual election because of COVID. More Hispanics had to work in in-person jobs, fewer had health insurance. And I think the shutdown Democrat argument against Biden in 2020 that Trump made actually was material, and it's still material today in our politics, because I think for some younger working people, Biden got on the other side of opportunity for them, and whereas Trump was the guy fighting to make sure they could continue to earn a living, right, and to feed their family. And that for Biden, the shutdown argument, I think, is lingering and is part of his brand that we've never really been able to fully overcome. And I think it's particularly important for people of lower socioeconomic status who needed to work every day in order to feed their family, right, who had no reserves. We have a more acute problem with white working class than we do with the overall working class. And the erosion that's taken place, the so-called erosion that's taken place with Hispanics and African Americans, I don't think is as great as some have argued. And let me make my case for this, is that on Hispanics, and as you know, this has been an area that I've been a pioneer in working with the Hispanic community. I mean, I did the first bilingual poll ever done in the Democratic Party and produced the first Spanish language ads back 20 years ago. And part of where I think a lot of the analysis on the Hispanic vote has gotten completely wrong is that it's not factoring in the growth of the population. And so if you get 65% of 100, that's 65 votes, right? But if you get 63% of 200, you have more. You know, a smaller piece of a bigger pie, you still get more pie. So in the Southwest, in the heavily Mexican-American parts of the United States, Democrats are far stronger in every state than they were 20 years ago. We are burying the Republican Party now in the Southwest and in California, and we're even getting reasonably close in Texas. We can't do it against Abbott, but in the other elections, we've gotten reasonably close. And so I think things are not nearly as dire as some folks of my colleagues in the industry have represented, in my view.
I feel like this is a little bit confusing things through statistics, or at least taking statistics that tell you different things. I take your point on the bigger pie, smaller percentage is still more pie. Nevertheless, if you keep losing percentage, eventually you get less of the pie. And so there's an erosion here, right? We watched it with Democrats, with the white working class. I mean, you could have said that for some time. It's like, okay, well, they're still winning the white working class. They're still winning it. Oh, now they're not winning it, but it's close enough. And so something is happening here. Whether you buy all of educational polarization or not, I'm on record many times saying I think educational polarization is tracking something else than what people think it is tracking. It is some kind of referent for class. And I think there's issues of cultural representation there and whether or not people feel respected and other things happening. So I don't love the educational polarization conversation, nor am I going to completely throw it overboard.
I'm with you, by the way. Can I endorse your interpretation of that?
Wonderful. I appreciate that. But, you are seeing and I take your point on the Southwest. But again, if Republicans begin closing that proportion gap, eventually they're going to close the election gap too.
But they're not. This candidate, Donald Trump, this candidate can't do that.
Maybe he can. Right? I don't know. I mean, I would not have expected, if you had told me from 2016 to 2020, for all the messaging, the Democratic Party, and the sense that like what Donald Trump was doing was destroying the Republican Party forever among voters of color, but maybe winning over these racist whites. Actually, what happens is that Joe Biden wins the election because suburban whites move over to him, even as they suffer very surprising defections among voters of color in different ways. And so I think you should take more seriously than you are, or I would at least like to get you to answer the question from the perspective of somebody who takes more seriously, that Democrats understand themselves to be the party of the working class. And even if they do have a majority now among voters making less than 100,000, they are increasingly reliant on a different kind of voter. And that is both a question for building a bigger majority, right? At some point, you got to start winning back some of these working class voters if you want 55%. It's also a kind of spiritual, moral identity question, right? If you're the party who your whole thing is that you are trying to make things better for working class Americans and you are losing your margin among working class Americans, I think you should wonder what is happening here. So if you were to buy that, what would you say is happening here?
Yeah, no, so I want to be clear that I think also to get granular on the data, right, I think we're seeing more erosion with working class men, right? I mean, I think and that also may have to do with Trump's machismo and his...
Yeah, that's closer to my theory of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's very real because it's not just people of color. There didn't used to be such big gender gaps in Black and Hispanic communities, and now there's starting to be significant gender gaps, which the abortion issue in the Hispanic community is exacerbating. I'm not dismissing this at all. We have to be concerned about the erosion you're describing, but we also have to be careful to be accurate in understanding what is actually happening. And yes, if we keep eroding, if we keep seeing a diminishment of our vote with Hispanics, some of the margins we have will be diminished. But that's not what's happening. I want to be clear, right? I mean, we are doing better in Arizona, in the parts of the country with heavily Mexican-American populations than we've ever done. I mean, where I find one of the people who make this argument, Rui Teixeira, to be so comical, frankly, is that his book is called, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? And yet we've just gotten more votes in the last 4 presidential elections than we've gotten since the 1930s and 40s. We're actually doing better nationally than we've done since he's been alive. And the idea that we're losing things as opposed to gaining things net is just not the right way to look at all this. Our coalition's changing, right? We have to adapt to it in part because their party is changing. And I think we have to be open and to do what you're describing, which is we have to really study this stuff and come to an understanding about how do we build majority coalitions. And so I hear you on the spiritual piece of this, and I think that we have work to do here. Look, I want to be very clear. I'm optimistic, but we have a lot of work to do. Big chunks of our coalition have wandered from us right now, and we've got work to do to get them back. Largely young people, people of color, right, are wandering from the Democratic Party right now. And if you look at polling, they're not wandering into being non-voters. They're wandering into third-party options for now, right? And so we're going to have to contest with these third-party candidates. We're going to have to go in there and fight it out. Joe Biden's not going to just have to run against one candidate. He could be running against 4, altogether. But I'm confident that we have a strong enough argument, and if the campaign is strong, I'm confident that we'll be reasonably successful.
You made this point that there were distinctive dynamics in 2020 around COVID that might have really cut Democrats' margins among Hispanics. I think that the possible analogy to that this year is young voters in Israel. And I'll be honest that 2 months ago, I wasn't taking this that seriously. I kind of figured it would blow over in American polling, and that may still very much be true, when you think 10 months into the future. But when I look at the polling now, it does seem very real to me. This is something that emotionally is very real to the people following it, which if you're on social media, you're one of them now, more often than not. And I'm curious how you take that, the possibility of a fracture over foreign policy between Biden and young voters who he very much needs to turn out, who did turn out in 2022, but that was before this war.
Yeah, who turned out in 2018, 2020, and 2022, right? We've had very, very strong historical performance with young people in recent elections. Would a foreign policy issue like this become a top-tier voting issue for any age cohort in the country in a general election that's going to be about so many other things, right? It would be unusual for that to happen. And for the marginal 25-year-old young voter in the United States, the idea that in November, Israel-Hamas will be more important to them than their job or healthcare or democracy or abortion or climate or guns, it's unlikely that that's the case. I think there is, though, however, an influential small group of young people who this is going to be a top-tier voting issue, and they're very organized and they're very loud, and they're going to be part of what we have to deal with. And it's one of the reasons why I've been very aggressive about trying to get the youth-oriented part of this campaign up. And what I hope is that we're going to see the most sophisticated, most well-funded youth campaign that we've ever seen in modern American history. I think the Biden team has to do this. I don't think they really have any choice. I think we're going to do really, really well with young people. We're going to do particularly really, really well with young women because of abortion and all the issues. I think we've got to start really treating the gender gap that's growing in the youth vote, which is connected to some of the other things we've talked about today, is something that has to become more understood about what's happening with young people. Many, many young women are just not available to Republicans anymore and may never be for the rest of their lives, by the way. I think this abortion extremism that we've seen, which we haven't really talked about very much today, is the kind of thing that could cause the Republicans to lose elections for a generation. It is one of the most extreme policy outcomes in American history, stripping rights away from more than half the population. What happens with men is going to be, we're going to have to contest that more. I think that some of the allure of Trump's machismo and his kind of Joe Rogan-ish positioning has been attractive to a lot of young men. And I think we're going to have to go in and fight it out with young men in a way that's going to be very different from young women.
One of the reasons I think it's important to look at the shifting composition is that parties have to adapt. You said this a minute ago, have to adapt to who is actually in them. And when you do that, it shifts what you can say, what you can do, right? This is very true for the Republicans. We can talk about the Democrats all day. The fact that Republicans have to adapt to being a MAGA coalition and have to say things that only the people in MAGA agree with, like the 2020 election was stolen, is a real problem for them. For Democrats, There is I think the concern, and you see it if you read Rui's book, you could see it if you read my colleague David Leonhardt's book, which is a more sort of economic take on this. His book is called Ours Was a Shining Future, and it's I think a very deep look at some of these issues. And the argument is that the Democratic Party, as it has become more connected to these higher income, more educated voters, has begun to reflect their concerns more, right? So emphasize things like environmentalism, abortion, things like that were certainly tough for abortion before Dobbs. But I think behind that is also reflect their cultural taste more. I think one of the things that happens with the educational polarization conversation is people want to look at it as materialism, but it's partially a question of class representation. That's something Donald Trump and some Republicans are increasingly good at, is saying to people who feel like they're on the outs of American life, whether they really are or not, I see you, I like you, you're great, these other people are terrible, their elite's looking down on you. And the Democratic Party is losing the kinds of voters, it seems to me, that don't like a vibe within the Democratic Party, right? They like the consumer protections, right? But they're not really that connected to politics. So tallying up the policies from one side or the other is not really how they think about politics. But they look around and they see a party led by people who they don't think would like them if they met them, right? That the most important question in politics is not, do you like the candidate, but do you think the candidate would like you? And that's the vulnerability here, that if these dynamics persist, we're not just talking about vote totals. We're talking about what a party feels like to people, because it reflects who has power in it. As the Democratic Party has more and more people with literal power in society inside of it, it reflects that turns off people who feel on the outside of that power structure. And that also just creates a very combustible kind of polarization in the country. That is, I think, my deeper concern about this set of things. Not that you can't imagine an electoral winning coalition, but you can imagine feedback cycle effects in terms of what the parties are that is not great for the country, not great for them, but also not great for what the Democratic Party has traditionally intended itself to be.
There's a lot there, Ezra.
Sure is.
We have to just ground ourselves in the reality that Trump has lost and the Republicans have lost the 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2023 elections. And so the loss is their loss, not our loss, right? And we have to not allow ourselves to sort of get to a place where the Democratic Party is in trouble or losing.
But I'm not saying that. I'm saying there's other dynamics that are worth taking seriously.
I know, but I think this notion that the Democratic Party is sort of in trouble or in losing, I just reject that in many of these arguments.
Well, what about able to vanquish MAGA, right? Not win elections by a bit, not win the Senate but lose the House, not win specials by a bit, but actually destroy it.
Well, let's see what happens in 2024. I want to go back to this basic reality that I think is not present adequately in the daily discourse that we all have with each other, which is that something really significant has happened in the last 2 years, which is the party in power has actually gained seats all across the country. It's an anomalous event. And so to me, this is the most important electoral data that exists, far more important than any crappy 800 sample poll that's being done out there right now, because we keep having a dramatic thing happen. There is a massive repudiation of MAGA happening all across the country. I'm going to answer your question here in a second, but I want to start by not conceding that the Republican Party is strong and winning. They're not. And so I don't know that their formula is successful. And I think what you're going to see in 2024 is a really substantial and significant splintering of the Republican Party. I think the never Trumper, never MAGA, former Republican wing of the Republican Party, if we were in a parliamentary system right now, there would be a new party, right? A center-right party that would have emerged with Liz Cheney as the head of it. She'd be in our cabinet. We would have, MAGA would be down in the 40s, right in the low 40s in polling, and we would be a sort of a coalition government. We can't do that in our system. I do think the Biden campaign is going to have to figure out some way to do that virtually. If we have Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney and Adam Kinzinger and all these folks campaigning for us in 2024, it's going to make a big difference. It's going to create a huge permission structure for Republicans who are not MAGA, which could be up to 20% of the Republican Party. By the way, we're talking about huge numbers. And I do think, going back to what you said earlier, my other response to all this is that You argued earlier that we're the party of normalcy, right? I mean, that we're the party that is presenting a normal face for America, a very normal guy, one of the most religious presidents in modern American history, right? That the face of the Democratic Party is one of normalcy and regular people, and that's part of our goal. We have investments being made in red states and red districts all across the country because of Biden's, huge investment agenda. We're not running away from Republican voters. We're trying to run towards them and help bring them into our coalition. And so I think I go back to this basic view that the things that we have to do are doable. Every party has issues. I mean, you have assets, liabilities, you've got challenges and things. But I don't think we're as culturally, if we were so culturally out of it, why do we keep winning elections again and again and again? And so I think this has been exaggerated in my view. I think it's a problem to be managed, but it's not a problem that is defining the Democratic Party. And frankly, on the issue of the polarization you're talking about, that polarization has been created and fostered by a political leader and by his allies in the right-wing media. And the idea that somehow we're responsible for the polarization in the country right now, I think is just unbelievable bullshit. Joe Biden has been a good president. He's been a good president for everybody. So I stand by this basic idea that the Democratic Party is strong. We're winning elections. I'm proud of my president, proud of my country, proud of my party. And I think we're going to have a really good election. And I think there's obviously, Ezra, to your point, there are things to worry about, things to manage. But I think on balance, things are going really well. And I'm really looking forward to this election and engaging with the Republicans frontally and having these arguments out in the public.
Always our final question. What are 3 books you would recommend to the audience?
Yeah, these are 3. I prepped for this, and it was an interesting question because it was not what have I read recently, but what would I recommend? So 3. I just finished a book called A New Deal for the World by Elizabeth Borgwart. I think a lot about how the 4 freedom speech that FDR gave in January of 1941 was really the beginning of the modern Democratic Party as we know it. And it put us on the side as Democrats. And I'll just do this really quickly, is that part of my whole story that I tell is that the world that we imagined and built as Democrats in the 1940s has created a golden age in human history. There's never been a better time to be alive in the history of the world, in the history of humanity, than it has been during this period of Pax Americana and the world that we imagined and built together. And as I tell Democrats in my talks, that we're part of the most noble political enterprise that's ever existed, the Democratic Party. We've done more good for more people than any other organized political entity in human history. And that's why this fight for preserving that global order and making sure that people of the world, their kids and their grandkids have the opportunities that we had is so central to everything that we need to do now as Democrats. We've been called before and we're being called again. The second book that I just went back and have been rereading is on Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. And his first chapter, which is called Do Not Obey in Advance, is something that I literally think about every single day about everything that I do. And it's a very powerful articulation of how we can't yield to the authoritarian narrative, story, impulse. We can't self-censor, and that we need to create our own reality and stay in our own reality and not yield to what they want us to do. I think this is so central. It's a central operating principle, I think, for Democrats and for people who are pro-democracy in the United States now. And then the third book, a little bit less weighty, was, I'm a big fan of Daniel Silva's, and his latest Gabrielle Alon book, The Collector, is something that I finally got to. It had been sitting on my bedside for months. And I just love his books.
Simon Rosenberg, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ezra, for what you do.
This episode of The Ezra Klein Show is produced by Roland Hu. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris. Our senior engineer is Jeff Gelb, with additional mixing by Efim Shapiro. Our senior editor is Claire Gordon. The show's production team also includes Annie Galvin and Kristen Lynn. We have original music by Isaac Jones, audience strategy by Christina Siemileski and Shannon Busta. The executive producer of New York Times Opinion Audio is Amy Rose Strasser, and special thanks to Sonia Herrero.